Where you are. You can hear good music in your head, so you want to share your songs with others. But the trouble is that it's difficult to translate your ideas into structured sound. So in this lesson, we'll take the first step toward the solution by learning to visualize music through color. And in the process, you'll discover the essential patterns that are at the very heart of music theory. What you will learn in this lesson. Here's a quick preview of what we'll cover in lesson 1. You will learn that all music is made from just 12 basic notes. That's all. You'll also learn how these notes got their names so you can understand the vocabulary of music. You'll then walk through the 5 simple steps needed to colorize these notes. Finally, you'll see how these 12 colors apply to the guitar fretboard in a logical and elegant way. Music is a language. Music is an amazing art form, obviously, which is why we're all drawn to it, right? Like a visceral beam of light, it shines with a clarity that cuts through the noise of everyday life to reveal the order and harmony of nature. Or at least it does when we close our eyes and just listen anyway, fully immersed in the audible structure of it all, and moved by the way it flows through our minds like a native tongue, so clear and coherent. Indeed, music sounds so intuitive that it feels as though our ears are already fluent in this language, because we can hear a song and it makes sense immediately. But what's strange is that once we open our eyes and try to visualize these same sounds, it's a different experience altogether, where the language understood by our ears looks utterly foreign to our eyes, as a mess of dots and lines and squiggles, right? I mean, it's such an odd thing about music, this dichotomy between the way it sounds and the way it looks, or how it's usually depicted anyway, because the difference is so extreme. And this gap in our perception, between what we hear and what we see, marks the divide between our ideas and their expression. Because as long as we're confused by the visual language of music, we'll struggle with the syntax of song, unable to fully articulate the music that we can hear inside. Do you get what I'm saying? And it's maddening, really. So what we need is a way to align our hearing with our sight. That is, to illustrate the patterns of music in such a way that they look as natural and simple as they sound, so that it's easy to translate one into the other. In other words, we need a Rosetta Stone of sorts to help us bridge the gap between the musical language of our ears and that of our eyes. Making the translation. For context, the Rosetta Stone was an ancient slab of rock found near the town of Rosetta, Egypt by Napoleon's army in 1799. Etched into the stone were the remnants of a decree in multiple languages, including Egyptian hieroglyphs, which were a cryptic form of writing whose meaning had been lost to history for more than a millennium. With the discovery of this artifact, however, scholars were able to decipher the hieroglyphs using one of the known languages also written on the stone. And as a result, they cracked the code to the otherwise unintelligible writings of ancient Egypt. So with that said, our musical hieroglyphs, as it were, are the cryptic symbols commonly used to depict music, like all the letters, numbers, dots, and images that are foreign to our eyes. And so what we need in our Rosetta Stone is another language to decode these symbols, a visual system that is, that we already understand, and one, moreover, that not only explains the visuals of music, but that also mirrors the patterns of sound. So a system, like I say, that bridges the gap between sound and sight. Get it? And with this system, we can then crack the code of music theory, literally, since we'll be able to see sound to become fully fluent in the language of music. And the system we can use, the one that's already native to our eyes and minds, and that reflects the natural patterns of sound, is color. Though not just any random set of colors, but these 12 specifically. Of course, these colors might look a little strange at first glance, like some oddly scrambled spectrum, and honestly, they might seem a bit limited too, or even anticlimactic with only 12. But as you will see next, these 12 colors are the key to your success as a songwriter, because they explain how everything works in music, and I mean everything. The mother of all patterns. These 12 colors are fundamental to what you'll learn, and here's why. Because in the lingo of music, they represent what's called the chromatic scale, and it's the mother of all note patterns. You see, everything you hear in music springs from this basic pattern, from melodies and chords to progressions and entire songs. It is the essential set of pitches that serves as the ultimate source of structured sound. In other words, all music can be boiled down to the notes of the chromatic scale. It's beautiful, really, and totally simple too, as you'll see for yourself going forward. But what's especially cool is that the guitar is actually made from this pattern, where each string on the fretboard represents its own chromatic scale. So the instrument is just one big stack of scales, like this. As a result, you can see how these 12 notes are important in the language of music, and that once you understand them, you can quickly crack the code of music theory to unlock the songs that are inside you. The only question is, how is this pattern formed? Since it really does look weird as we observed. I mean, when I said that color is the answer, you might have envisioned something else instead, like the color spectrum, with all the hues in sequence, like this. After all, this is how colors are arranged in nature, not mixed up into some strange pattern. And since the word chromatic comes from the Greek word chroma, meaning color, we might assume that if anything, the chromatic scale would form a seamless rainbow of hues, so the guitar would look more like this, all natural and straightforward. And for that matter, what's up with these shapes too? All the squares and circles, that is, in their alternating sequence. What's the significance of this pattern along with the colors? Well, the truth is that there's a logic to these colors and shapes that's actually very simple once you understand it. There's just a twist to how you get there, literally. So to explain, let's take a closer look at this basic pattern to see exactly what it means and how it was formed in the first place. Cracking the code. Like I said, the chromatic scale is fundamental to music as the source of every pattern you play on the guitar. So without question, it's essential to learn as you become a master songwriter. In fact, the better you understand it, the better your music will be. It's true. Though admittedly, it's also true that these 12 colors look pretty scrambled when you first see them. Indeed, they even seem sort of random. So to make sense of what we're seeing, let's go back and reconstruct this pattern from scratch. Or better said, let's go back to before any colors or shapes are introduced, starting with some of the symbols traditionally used in music to label the notes. Then we'll walk through the 5 steps it takes to arrive at visible sound and our colorized chromatic scale. It's easy actually, and fascinating too. And in the process, you'll come to understand not only this color pattern, but also the standard musical symbols as well. In a nutshell, these are the steps that will follow. 5 basic steps. 1. Start with the chromatic scale. 2. Play the major scale. 3. Create the circle of fifths. 4. Add the color wheel. 5. Return to the chromatic scale. So here goes. Step 1. Start with the chromatic scale. The first step to understanding the chromatic scale is to learn the names of the notes, which musicians label using letters. And specifically, these are the letters used, along with some symbols called sharps, shown by a pound sign, and flats, illustrated by a lowercase b. Now I know this pattern is puzzling right out of the gate, and that's for 2 reasons really. 1, because it starts with the letter C instead of A, as you might expect, since A is listed first in the English alphabet. And 2, because the extra sharp and flat symbols are strange, like nothing we see in everyday language. So to clear things up right away, here's what you should know to begin. First, music is its own language, not English, and so it operates in a different way. And more importantly, these letter names for notes are arbitrary anyway, as you'll soon discover. So don't get hung up on trying to reconcile music with the alphabet, because they're not the same. Second, these sharp and flat symbols are objectively strange, it's true. And it's not clear why some of the notes have 2 letter names with extra symbols while some don't. So next we'll look closely at how these names came about to understand the logic of these labels. And what you'll find is that it's really not too complicated. Of course, these symbols on their own are confusing at best, but really, they're not so bad once you know their origin, which is this. Initially, the note names were meant to follow the black and white pattern of keys on the piano, and that's why they look so odd. Do you see? While the white keys are labeled by letters alone, the black keys are marked by letters with sharps and flats, which is why these symbols form a staggered pattern. You see, back in the day when these labels were created, in the Middle Ages, musicians had no other way to reference each note. So what they did was to pick a few letters from the alphabet as a quick fix and named the white keys A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Granted, they could have just taken the first 12 letters of the alphabet, A through L, and applied them to the keys in sequence like this instead. But for reasons we'll explore later on, they started with the white keys and letters A through G. And the reason they used only 7 letters in total is because the chromatic scale is repeated up and down the keyboard in different pitch ranges called octaves. So they didn't need anything more than that since the same notes appear over and over again. Get it? That much makes enough sense, right? And if that's all there was to it, then the letter names for notes wouldn't cause much of a fuss, or at least it would seem so initially. But when you pause to look at this pattern more carefully, you'll see that there's also a catch, caused by the uneven spacing between white keys. And the snag is this. Because there are gaps, black keys, between the white keys, labeled A through G, we can't just assign 5 more letters to the remaining notes, like H through L for example, and expect the sequence to make sense. because what we'd end up with is a jumbled alphabet like this, right? I mean, it's pretty much up to the point of absurdity. So what musicians did instead was assign the same 7 letters, A through G, to the black keys as well, accompanied by extra sharp symbols and flat symbols to distinguish each note from the others, with the result that every black key was given 2 names. And while that may seem strange or even counterintuitive at first, and the resulting symbols look a little crazy, the logic behind these labels is simple enough once you know what they mean. So I'll explain. In music, the term sharp just means slightly higher in pitch. So the pitch above C, for example, is C sharp because it's slightly higher than plain old C. Get it? Likewise, the pitch above D is D sharp, while the pitch above F is F sharp, and so on, like this. And in reverse, the term flat means slightly lower in pitch. So moving in the opposite direction, the pitch below B is B flat, while the pitch below A is A flat, etc. You see? So this is why every black key in the chromatic scale has 2 labels, or what musicians call enharmonic names, which are just sharp and flat synonyms for the same notes. So in total, the chromatic scale has only 12 basic notes, and that's all, even though the letter names make it look like there are more. Altogether, it includes 7 white notes, also called natural pitches, and 5 black notes, known as sharp or flat pitches. And this simple fact that there are only 12 notes in music is your key to understanding theory, the guitar fretboard, and the art of songwriting, as you'll see. But before you move on, take the first quiz of lesson 1 and complete the first set of exercises to solidify what you've learned so far. Just download the PDF found in the lesson materials, print it, and write your answers directly on each page. It's easy. Step 2, play the major scale. The chromatic scale is cool because it includes every note in music. That is, all 12 pitches laid out in order, so as you move from one pitch to the next, they gradually rise going up the scale and fall moving down the scale. But while the chromatic scale forms the complete set of notes, this pattern actually doesn't sound very musical on its own. So musicians use it more like a painter's palette to pick out smaller groups of notes that sound especially good together. That's basically how it is used. And these smaller patterns, like melodies and chords for example, are made by playing only some notes of the chromatic scale while skipping others, using what musicians call intervals, which are the spaces or gaps between notes. Later in part 1, you'll learn more about intervals than you ever imagined, and you'll see that there are a variety to choose from. But at the most basic level, there are 2 main types, half steps and whole steps, which we'll illustrate using squares and circles. To explain, a half step separates any 2 notes that are adjacent. So as you move from one note to the next in the chromatic scale, you pass through a series of half step intervals. Square, circle, and so on. A whole step interval, in contrast, is just a combination of 2 half steps. So you play a whole step by skipping every other note. And with the alternating shapes, it's easy to see as well, since all of the square notes are spaced at whole step intervals, as are the circles too. Get it? Half steps and whole steps are both very simple, and with the shapes as a visual aid, they're especially easy to understand. But the point and power of these intervals really comes into play when you combine them into new and interesting patterns, because these combinations derived from half steps and whole steps is what music is really about. Indeed, without these intervals, music would be nothing. They are what make all the other patterns possible in a song, from scales and melodies to chords and progressions. And by far the most popular interval pattern of all in music, the most recognizable one with the strongest primal appeal, is a little sequence that musicians call the major scale. You've heard it before. It goes do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And it sounds so good that it could have been crafted by angels. But really, this scale is made by combining whole step and half step intervals like this, where whole steps are illustrated by a W and half steps are shown by an H. Starting on the C note, for example, this C major scale sounds awesome and much better than the chromatic scale alone due to the way it injects a sense of movement into the notes. And it does this by carving out its own section of the broader, more neutral sounding chromatic scale through the use of intervals, of course. Intervals that establish C as the tonal center of gravity, if you will, for all the other notes in the key. So to compare, here's the chromatic scale starting on C. And then here's the major scale starting on C as well. The major scale sounds so much better. In music, the concept of a key refers to a group of notes that share an audible home base, so to speak, or tonal center, established by the first and last notes of the major scale. Like the key of C, for example, defined by the C major scale. In Lesson 2, you'll learn more about the major scale and how to play it on your guitar. And in Lesson 3, you'll come to understand exactly why this particular interval pattern is used. But the point here is that it's formed by a simple sequence of whole steps and half steps that sound especially good together. Again, the whole steps are shown by a W and the half steps are shown by an H. And what's more is that you can actually play this same sequence of intervals starting on any note of the chromatic scale, such as D flat to make a D flat major scale, for example, or D to make a D major scale, or E flat, or E, or F, etc. And as a result, you can chop up the chromatic scale into 12 different major scales, with each starting on a different pitch, as shown here. And in the PDF for this lesson, you can see all of these major scales in one full-size image. Interesting, right? So in this way, you can see that there are 12 major scales in music, where each one shifts the tonal center just enough to create a different key, which is beautiful and significant too in our next step towards seeing sound. Step 3, create the circle of fifths. Using intervals, the major scale turns the chromatic scale into something more musical. Like magic, these intervals inject a sense of energy and movement into the notes you play. And by simply starting this pattern on each separate note, you can create a total of 12 major scales. It's awesome. But for as good as the major scale sounds and how prominent it is in music, there's an even more powerful pattern as it turns out. One that outshines the major scale by far in terms of its beauty, elegance, and overall influence. And this pattern is called the circle of fifths. In fact, compared to the spark of magic you hear in the major scale, the circle of fifths is more like a high voltage electrical powerhouse, full of intense and dynamic force. And the reason why is because this pattern is essentially a super mega major scale on steroids, comprised of all 12 scales wrapped into one. Indeed, it's remarkable how it's built and the way it functions. So to show you what I mean, let's look at exactly how the circle of fifths is constructed, starting with the C major scale as the first segment of this pattern. And in the process, you'll also learn why it's called the circle of fifths. As you already know, this scale is a subset of the chromatic scale, formed by a sequence of whole steps and half steps that sound good together. Really good, in fact. And because of how it's capped by C notes at each end, this pattern feels distinctly complete too, as if it were a single unit of compatible pitches, that is, self-contained and independent, like an island unto itself, you might say. Do you know what I mean? As a group, these 8 notes just sound so whole. But when you look carefully, you'll see that the scale actually lives within a larger ecosystem of sorts, as only a small part of a bigger, overlapping web of patterns. It's wonderful, really, and the way it works is this. When you split the major scale down the middle, you'll see that it's made up of 2 equal halves, where each half is an identical group of 2 whole steps, shown by a W, followed by a half step, shown as an H, like this. Do you see? It's easy to recognize when shown this way, especially with the squares and circles which help to highlight this repeating pattern. And it's this repetition, this duplication of intervals, that explains why the major scale sounds so nice. Because it's more than just a random sequence of notes, but one that exhibits a natural symmetry as well, and specifically what geometry nerds call translational symmetry. For context, translational symmetry differs from the other more common types that everyone knows, such as reflectional symmetry and rotational symmetry. So to illustrate the distinctions between them, the following shows how each of these function using the letter P for pattern as an example. Reflectional. Also known as mirror symmetry, this type occurs when the reverse of an object or pattern is reflected over a line or mirror. Rotational. Also known as radial symmetry, this kind happens when an object or pattern remains unchanged but rotates around a fixed point. Translational. This type of symmetry occurs when an object or pattern remains unchanged but is translated or repeated at intervals along a path. Each type of symmetry is unique, as you can see, and as we advance you'll find that all 3 appear in music. But for now, we'll start with translational symmetry and the fact that the intervals in the major scale are repeated, which is interesting, like I said, and even marvelous. But what's even better is the way this repetition reveals a special link between scales, where some of the same note patterns appear in multiple keys, and specifically the fact that each half of a given scale straddles 2 keys in particular. For example, when you look at the C major scale again, you can see that this pattern is comprised of 2 parts, C, D, E, F, and G, A, B, C. And when you sort through all the other major scales, you'll find that another one, G major, shares 4 of the same notes, G, A, B, C, but as the first half of that scale instead of the second. Get it? This group of notes is identical. In C major, it's the second half, while in G major, it's the first half, but the pattern is the same, G, A, B, C. And as a result, you could say these two scales sort of bleed into each other, like conjoined twins in a way, interconnected with tonal centers that are closely related. It's beautiful, really, and what's cool is that it doesn't stop there, because the G major scale likewise overlaps with another scale, D major, like this. And by extension, D major also overlaps with A major, and so on, where each scale naturally leads to the next in a continual chain. And by continual, I really mean it's endless, as the sequence cycles through all 12 keys over and over again, linking them in a single pattern that goes on forever. In fact, to illustrate this cycle in a concise way, we can just show it like this, as one big ring of interlocking scales that repeats to infinity. And as a result, the symmetry that links these scales together is rotational after all, since the pattern of repetition is a circle instead of a straight line. Do you see what I mean? It's amazing. And this daisy chain sequence that results explains where this pattern got its name, because each new scale starts on the 5th note of the previous scale, which is why it's called the circle of fifths. Get it? So while the chromatic scale is the mother of all note patterns, and the major scales are like its children, the circle of fifths is more like the mother lode, as the source of all meaningful patterns in music, which will inform everything you see going forward. Step 4. Add the color wheel. The circle of fifths is beautiful because it shows how music works, in the sense that it's a system of relationships, of various notes and intervals that intertwine to form a web of organized sound. But for as revealing as it is into the intricate and symmetrical nature of music, this structure is still difficult to discern. I mean really, because it's still seen through a veil of abstract symbols, which obscures our view and slows our understanding. So, for example, although we know that the G major scale is equal parts C and D, and we can actually see this overlap in the circle of fifths, this link is still not immediately obvious, at least not by looking at the letters alone. After all, why should G be related to C or D? There's nothing intuitive about that, or for that matter, about the order of any letter names in the circle of fifths. On their own, the letters don't clearly reveal these connections, and with the sharps and flats mixed in, this whole pattern looks less like music and more like a scrambled bowl of alphabet symbol soup. So to really understand this pattern, which is fundamental to music, we need something better, something more intuitive to illustrate the connections between notes and intervals and keys. We need symbols that are more natural than these letters, sharps and flats. And as you already know, the answer is this. What we need is color, and specifically the color wheel, as it turns out, because this pattern happens to mirror the way notes relate in music. In fact, the correlation is so exact that it's spooky, because something remarkable happens when you apply the 12 colors of the color wheel to the 12 keys in the circle of fifths. They align perfectly. And by that, I don't just mean they're similar, I mean the match is exact, conceptually as well as visually, in the way that all the colors bleed seamlessly into one another, just as all the keys overlap as well. Both systems, color and music, are structured the same way. And as a result, it's now easy to see how all the keys relate. Truly. For example, it's now clear, with the aid of color, how keys G, C, and D are connected, since red-orange, G, is made of equal parts red, C, and orange, D. Get it? Likewise, you can also see at a glance that orange, D, is equal parts red-orange, G, and orange-yellow, A. Orange-yellow, A, is equal parts orange, D, and yellow, E, and so on. So what you hear is what you see, since the color wheel and circle of fifths follow the very same pattern. Indeed, they are the same pattern. Only one is audible while the other is visible. But like two languages that tell the same story, they are essentially one. And now that we've merged sound with sight in this way, we can start to make better sense of music by returning full circle to the chromatic scale. Step 5. Return to the chromatic scale. The circle of fifths is beautiful because it shows how all the keys are related. Like a concise dashboard of musical connections, it reveals the essential patterns and logic of music theory. And now that we can see sound, which is the very definition of music theory, we can make use of these insights to master the guitar and songwriting. or at least that's where we're headed now that our path is illuminated by color. But to get there, we have one more step to take in the process of visualizing music, and that is to convert the circle of fifths back into the chromatic scale, since that's the pattern we use to make music on an instrument. And then we can picture any pattern we might possibly play. Do you see what I mean? It's a really important step, and as it turns out, it's also easy. In fact, this conversion is surprisingly simple because all we have to do is take every other note in the circle of fifths, like all the circles for example, and then rotate them 180 degrees so that each pair of complementary colors swaps places. And like magic, we're suddenly looking at the chromatic scale again with all the notes laid out in sequence. C, D flat, D, E flat, E, etc. Get it? It's pretty crazy actually, the way these patterns can morph into each other so elegantly. But it's real and insightful too, because now the chromatic scale springs to life as well, all in vivid color, so we can start to see how its notes are connected. And what's clear is that the chromatic scale is just a twisted color wheel, that's all, as a rearrangement of the circle of fifths, which in turn explains why its sequence looks so strange, like a scrambled spectrum of sorts you could say, because it really is. You see? Only now that we know the logic behind this pattern, or how it was formed and what it means, we can advance with true vision, gradually learning more about the way it works through part one, and then applying what we discover to the art of songwriting. It's wonderful. The guitar matrix. Of course, we've covered a lot of ground in this lesson, navigating our way through a series of patterns to arrive at visible sound. So as a quick recap, let's summarize the 5 steps here. Step 1, start with the chromatic scale. Music is made up of 12 basic notes. These notes are arranged into what's called the chromatic scale, which is the mother of all note patterns. Step 2, play the major scale. The chromatic scale, however, doesn't sound very good on its own, so musicians use it to play smaller note patterns, and by far the most popular pattern is the major scale. Step 3, create the circle of fifths. You can actually play 12 major scales in music, and they're all interconnected. Together, these scales form one big overlapping sequence called the circle of fifths. Step 4, add the color wheel. The circle of fifths reveals how all keys relate, and you can see these relationships clearly using color. That's because the circle of fifths and the color wheel follow the same pattern. Step 5, return to the chromatic scale. Once you can see sound using color, you simply rotate the circle of fifths back into the chromatic scale. Only now you can easily see all musical relationships baked into the notes. Cool, right? In just 5 steps we can go from invisible sound to color music. And now that we've cracked the code to music theory, we have a serious advantage. Or at least almost, because there's still one more step for us to fully understand what we're seeing, and that is to actually apply these colors to the guitar. After all, the whole point is to make music, right? Not just study it in silence from afar. So what we have to do next, in order to really dive into things, is to somehow transfer our cyclical chromatic scale to the linear fretboard, so that we can literally play these notes on the instrument. But how? Well, the answer is simple, and something that you already saw at the start of this lesson, which is this. Because every string on the guitar is a chromatic scale, with the notes rising in half-step intervals through each fret, all we have to do is unwind our circular scale and apply it to the fretboard like this. And then of course, we can just do the same with each string to fill in the fretboard with notes that follow the guitar's tuning. Granted, the resulting matrix looks sort of odd at first, as yet another pattern of colors that might seem random. But it's not random. Indeed, it's anything but that, as you'll learn in lesson 2 when we explore it in more detail, so you know exactly how this pattern works and why it looks this way. But for now anyway, here's the basic reason for this arrangement. Because the fretboard sits at the intersection of 2 patterns, the chromatic scale and the circle of fifths, which merge together into one array. For while each string is an individual scale, all of these scales are stacked in such a way that every fret forms a circle of fifths sequence like this. Do you see what I'm saying? So while the fretboard might look a little chaotic at first glance, it's actually organized with perfection, which is wonderful. Of course, there's a slight shift in this pattern at the top 2 strings, which I'll explain in the next lesson, but otherwise, all of the notes form a consistent pattern that's orderly and elegant. Anyway, so now that we can see sound, let's take a closer look at this matrix in lesson 2, where we'll pick it apart to play all sorts of patterns. And in the process, we'll gain even greater insight into the fundamentals of theory. It's awesome. And believe me, you still ain't seen nothing yet. So to make sure you're ready to move on, complete the last quiz and exercises of this lesson. Then jump into lesson 2 already. And by the way, in case you don't already have some, go to mycolormusic.com to get your own fretboard labels. They will give you superpowers. I'll see you in lesson 2.